Before Atlanta was called Atlanta, it was known as Terminus. It got that name around 1840 because it was on the spot where the new Western and Atlantic Railroad ended. The railroad came from Chattanooga, and this was the terminus, the end of the line. Ever since then, trains have played a very important role in Georgia's history.
The railroads made Atlanta. The railroads were just as important to Atlanta back in those days as the airports are today.
In the 19th century, trains were all driven by steam. John Gilbert teaches people about trains at Big Shanty Museum.
Oh, this is where the locomotive was operated from. The engineer sat over here and the fireman sat over there. Now, this wasn't like a fireman that goes and puts out a fire. He was in charge of getting the wood and taking it, and he would open the firebox here and throw in the wood to keep the steam boiling, to keep the water boiling to generate steam. So he had a lot of work to do. Your firemen back in those days had really big arms, tough guys.
The Civil War was known as the First Railroad War.
So railroads were vitally important during the Civil War because these battles were fought up and down railroad lines. As the Southerners were retreating, they would burn the bridges and pull up the railroad tracks. Now, Sherman would march down to the sea. Again, he would rebuild the railroads ahead of him, move his men and supplies down the railroads, and then he would tear up the railroad in his rear so no one could come up behind him. And he had a really good method for doing this. He would take the rails and pull them up, lay them on a pile of cross ties, and then heat them till the rails were cherry red, and then they'd get a couple of men on each end. They would run and they would wrap those rails around a tree, and those came to be known as Sherman's neckties.
In 1862, a man named James Andrews and a group of Union soldiers staged a daring raid into North Georgia. The Great Locomotive Chase, as it came to be called, was made into a funny, silent movie, but the raid was deadly serious. Andrews' raiders stole an engine called the General. Today, the General is in the Big Shanty Museum in Kennesaw, Georgia.
Now, their idea was to take this locomotive, and they were going to race it to Chattanooga, and they were going to tear up the tracks and burn the railroad bridges. The conductor of the General, who had lost his train had been stolen, his name was William A. Fuller. Now, William A. Fuller started after the General on foot, hard as he could run down the tracks.
The conductor found a locomotive called the Texas, and the chase was on.
Now, one thing about these locomotives, they only get about 33 miles to a cord of wood. So that means that they've got to stop every so often, and they've got to put more wood into the tender, and they've also got to take on water, because it's fire and water that power this locomotive. So the Texas stayed so close behind the General, they weren't able to take on wood and water, and finally the General just simply ran out of fuel, and the steam was so exhausted by the time that they ran out of wood that all of the men on the General, they pulled the locomotive into reverse, and they jumped off the train.
And all of the Union raiders were captured, and Andrews and 7 others were hanged by the Confederates. But 19 of the men who participated in the raid, even the ones who were hanged, received the Congressional Medal of Honor, the first ever issued by Congress.
Unfortunately, James J. Andrews could not receive the medal because he was a civilian.
The railroads made Atlanta a good place to do business. They connected the city and the state to the rest of the country. Trains carried cotton out and brought goods and materials in. So the railroads were rebuilt almost as soon as the Civil War ended.
Steamboats, the rivers, were still important in getting cotton to market, but rail could do it cheaper and faster, and in many cases more directly. So railroads had become very important. So in the years after the war, all efforts were lent toward getting the railroads back on their feet.
Up and down this road I go, keep and dodging the 44 red man. Hey, won't you learn it?
Building the railroads was hard work. A lot of it was done by groups of African-American men. These workers laid the track and repaired it. If a train wrecked or a bridge washed out, it was their job to clean up. They often used tools made by the Gandy Manufacturing Company, and they sang while they worked.
Well, believe I liked Alabama that best.
Some people think that's how they got their name, Gandy dancers.
Singing songs will take your mind off what you're doing. If you think about doing something that's a toiling, hard task all day long, you would probably sing too, if you could.
But there was another reason why the Gandhi dancers sang. The rhythm of the music helped coordinate their movements. Gandhi dancers did heavy, dangerous jobs, so everyone had to work together.
Because if you don't synchronize your efforts, then if everybody's pulling at or picking up at different times, no man can lift that rail.
If you imagine maybe 3 of us trying to move a grand piano, what would we do? We'd all get in position, right? And then we'd say, 1, 2, 3, go, right? Okay, that's essentially what they were doing, but they were making music out of it. They were making art out of it.
Yeah. Talk about the big cat whooping nest in your hood. That's where the left more bees on me. Ooh. Oh, me. Ooh. Me. Oh, me.
Have the tracks always been this size?
These tracks are 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide. Now, it's kind of interesting. This is the same size as the old Roman chariot wheels.
The distance between the rails is called the gauge. But until 1886, the gauges of northern and southern tracks were different.
Now, the standard gauge in the south was 5 feet between the rails, and the northern gauges were 4 feet, 8.5 inches. In 1886, they decided they want all the railroads in the United States one gauge. And in 48 hours, they took every rail and moved it in just a little bit to make the standard gauge. Did that in 2 days. On into this century, engines continued to get larger and larger. This is the 750 here. This is an example of an engine that was built in 1910. And look how big these wheels are. These are tremendous wheels. And this engine was used for both freight and passenger service. And look, the wheels are tall as I am.
Railroads continued to grow in Georgia. The train routes had fancy names like Dixie Flyer and Silver Comet and the Peach Queen.
Passenger service in Atlanta reached its height in 1914 when 152 passenger trains stopped in Atlanta every single day. That's an average of 1 train every 10 minutes. From 152 trains in 1914, Atlanta only has 2 passenger trains stopping today, the northbound Crescent and the southbound Crescent.
Today, trains are still important to Georgia, but they're freight trains pulled by diesel engines. Passenger trains have almost vanished. They've been replaced by cars and interstate highways and airplanes. The day of the steam locomotive has all but passed away.